There's a place in southeastern Ohio that even the bravest locals avoid after dark. A weathered stone marker stands there, whispering a secret the world wasn't meant to know. New Canaan Community Farm, 1837-1863. In God's grace we trust. But those words are a lie. Beneath that cold stone lie the remains of over 200 men, women and children, their lives stolen by a family whose name became a nightmare, the Colemans. Elder Daniel Coleman, a man of piercing blue eyes and unshakable charisma, didn't just preach salvation. He weaponized it. He turned faith into fear, devotion into chains, and labor into a slow, methodical murder. His wife Sarah, stern and calculating, ruled the women with the same iron fist. Their children were trained from infancy to enforce their father's cruel doctrine, perfect extensions of his will, eyes that saw too much and hearts that felt too little. When families arrived, lured by promises of harmony and divine favor, they entered a trap disguised as paradise. Workdays bled into nights, meals shrank to thin soup, and questions were punished with public humiliation or disappearance. And yet, the Colemans thrived. Their clothing remained pristine, their bodies nourished, their voices commanding, while those who toiled beneath them broke slowly, irreversibly. If you want to uncover these dark truths with us and witness history the world tried to bury, hit that subscribe button now. Because what you are about to hear is not for the faint of heart. At night, the main house resonated with laughter and music, the clinking of fine china, echoes of indulgence impossible in a community of scarcity and fear. Those who noticed knew the truth too late. This was not salvation. It was a prison. The rolling hills, the dense forests, even the Ohio River itself seemed complicit, hiding horrors that would make the mind reel. Today, for the first time, you will hear the complete story of Elder Daniel Coleman and the family who turned faith into tyranny. This isn't just history. It's a lesson in human malleability, a masterclass in power, manipulation, and the darkness men are capable of when the line between God and man is blurred. What you are about to learn will disturb you. It will challenge everything you think you know about morality, control, and the fragility of the human spirit. If you survive these truths, nothing about your understanding of power, trust, or family will ever be the same. The year was 1837, and America was hungry for salvation. The Second Great Awakening had swept across the frontier like wildfire, leaving men and women desperate for meaning, willing to surrender their lives to a higher purpose. In the valleys of Athens County, Ohio, the wilderness pressed close, hiding dangers and secrets that daylight never revealed. It was here, among rolling hills and dense forests, that Elder Daniel Coleman first set foot on the 400 acres he would claim as his kingdom. He arrived not as a simple farmer, not as a humble preacher, but as a man with vision sharpened by ambition and a mind capable of bending faith to his will. His story was compelling. He spoke of corrupt church leaders, of persecution, of a divine calling to establish a new Eden where the faithful could live in perfect harmony with God. Locals were drawn to his confidence, the conviction that glinted in his piercing blue eyes. Families seeking refuge from poverty, hardship, or disappointment listened, hungering for a purpose beyond toil. Coleman purchased the property with gold coins, a shocking display of wealth that made him untouchable in the eyes of ordinary men. The main house, a two-story brick structure perched on a hill, overlooked fertile fields, dense woods, and a stream that promised life but soon delivered something else entirely. Within weeks, he had begun placing advertisements in newspapers across Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Virginia. His message was irresistible, a place of shared prosperity, communal living, spiritual purity, and guaranteed salvation for the faithful. Families arrived with hope in their eyes, wagons full of possessions, children clutching dolls or books, hearts open to promises that would soon become nightmares. From the very first day, Coleman's methods were subtle but precise. Work was demanding, yet framed as spiritual duty. Praise was given sparingly, punishment administered under the guise of divine correction. Questions were considered temptations, doubts a reflection of spiritual weakness. His family acted as extensions of his authority. Sarah monitored the women, enforcing obedience with quiet cruelty. Joshua managed supplies, subtly starving those who defied instructions. Rebecca served as the eyes of her father, recording transgressions, whispering warnings. Even young Ezra absorbed the lessons of control, learning that power was to be wielded without mercy. As spring turned to summer, the first signs of the community's corruption began to appear. Families who arrived full of hope found themselves exhausted, ill-fed, and fearful. A subtle terror permeated the air, the unspoken understanding that every choice, every misstep, every moment of doubt could bring consequences far beyond imagination. And yet, most clung to Coleman's words, convinced that surrendering their will to him was the only path to salvation. The first winter at New Canaan was the crucible that revealed Elder Daniel Coleman's true nature. Families who had arrived full of hope now found themselves trapped in a routine of exhaustion, fear, and quiet despair. Workdays began before dawn and stretched into the late evening. Meals, once promised to be shared and plentiful, dwindled to thin broth and stale bread. Any attempt to rest beyond the allotted minutes was met with harsh reprimand, and every infraction, no matter how minor, became an opportunity for public humiliation. Coleman preached that suffering was divine purification, that the flesh must be weakened so the spirit could grow stronger. But what he called purification was a methodical erasure of human dignity. The first death came quietly, as if the land itself conspired to shield it from the world. Thomas Henderson, a man who had brought his family from Pennsylvania with hope in his eyes, collapsed while clearing stumps in the North Field. Officially, it was heart failure brought on by the joy of serving the Lord. But those who dared to look closer, like his widow, Martha, knew the truth. 16-hour workdays, inadequate nourishment, and relentless labor had crushed him. The funeral was an event carefully orchestrated by Coleman, a sermon of divine favor that lasted hours, convincing the survivors that Thomas had ascended to eternal glory and that his suffering was righteous. As the weeks passed, more deaths followed. Mary Washington, a young mother of 3, froze to death in her cabin after her family was denied firewood. Elder Coleman framed her death as divine mercy, a release from the trials awaiting the faithful. Slowly, the community learned to fear not just death, but the twisted way it was justified. Nights were no refuge. From the main house came music, laughter, and the clinking of fine china. Sounds that reminded the workers of the life they had been denied, the comforts they would never taste, and the power that ruled over them with impunity. Even the children were not spared. Those who showed promise were separated from their parents and groomed to enforce Coleman's system of cruelty. Others were forced into labor as soon as they could walk, their small bodies straining against relentless demands. The community's hierarchy had taken root: Daniel as divine authority, Sarah as ruthless overseer of women, Joshua as master of supplies, Rebecca as recorder of sins, and Ezra, the youngest, already learning that cruelty was power. By the end of that first brutal winter, the survivors carried a haunted look in their eyes, a knowledge of horrors they could not speak aloud. They were trapped not just by distance or fear of the outside world, but by the psychological chains Coleman had woven into their very souls. This was no sanctuary, no Eden. It was a prison, and they were only beginning to understand the depth of its darkness. It was young Peter Miller, only 14, who stumbled upon the first undeniable proof of the true nightmare at New Canaan. While cleaning the root cellar, he discovered a hidden cache: family Bibles, jewelry, watches, personal mementos, treasures that belonged to the deceased, items that should have been sent to relatives or buried with the dead. The hoard reeked of deliberate malice, a quiet testimony to the Coleman family's obsession with control and possession. When Peter tried to confront Elder Coleman, he was met with cold authority and the promise of a spiritual cleansing for daring to think impure thoughts. That night, Peter disappeared. Officially, he had run away, unable to endure the discipline of spiritual growth. But his mother, Elizabeth, followed a trail of blood through the woods and knew, with a certainty that froze her blood, that her son had been taken. The discovery revealed a chilling pattern: the Colemans did not merely dominate lives, they commodified them. Death, suffering, and disappearance were tools, manipulated with precision to maintain authority. Families understood, silently, that each new face arriving at New Canaan was another pawn, another source of wealth, another soul to be broken and consumed. The isolation was absolute. The nearest town was miles away, through forests that seemed alive with menace, making escape not just difficult but nearly impossible. Even letters to the outside world were censored by Rebecca, who claimed she protected the community from worldly corruption. In truth, she was the gatekeeper, ensuring that no one's cries or warnings could reach beyond the hills. The Colemans thrived while others starved and suffered. Their clothing remained immaculate, their meals untouched by scarcity, their leisure protected, while the rest of the community toiled. And then came the night sounds, laughter, music, clinking china, echoes of indulgence that mocked the misery below. Every moment of joy for the Colemans was a calculated reminder they controlled everything, even life itself. Those who noticed, those who dared to see through the veil, felt the cold realization that this was not salvation. It was a meticulously designed prison, and yet the world outside remained oblivious. Coleman had perfected the art of deception. Visitors were given carefully curated tours, while the sick and dying were hidden or sent to distant work details. Local authorities were deceived by reports written in Coleman's own hand, detailing a picture of peace and piety. Complaints that filtered through were dismissed as the ramblings of weak-willed individuals who could not endure divine discipline. In every way, the Colemans had constructed a fortress of silence, fear, and manipulation, and it was only the beginning. By the winter of 1851, New Canaan's routine of suffering had become a well-oiled machine, and the Coleman family's cruelty had evolved into something far more sinister. A severe influenza outbreak swept through the overcrowded cabins, killing 37 people in less than 2 months. But this was no accident. Anna Thompson, a widow who had been assigned to care for the sick, began to notice disturbing patterns. Contaminated blankets moved from cabin to cabin, food prepared for the weak and dying tainted in subtle ways. And the hand behind it, Rebecca Coleman, only 19, moving with deliberate cruelty, her face a mask of innocence as she ensured that those already weak would not survive. The community began to understand that illness, like hunger and overwork, had been weaponized against them. Sickness was no longer a natural event. It was an instrument of control. Families learned quickly that resistance or questioning would mark them for attention. Those who spoke too freely were isolated, sent to work details in the deep woods, or simply disappeared in the dead of night. Their deaths were explained in sermons as divine will, their disappearances cloaked in lies of spiritual assignment. Fear became instinct, and instinct became obedience. Anna's horror deepened when she cleaned the cabin of the Williams family, recently deceased. Beneath a loose floorboard, she discovered a journal kept by Robert Williams, a former schoolteacher. Its pages were a map of evil dates, names, and methods meticulously recorded. Food withheld from dissenters, accidents arranged to punish curiosity, and poison used to mimic common illnesses. Each entry revealed the systematic nature of the Coleman family's power. Daniel Coleman was not the man he claimed to be. His real name was David Khalilton, wanted for fraud and murder in 3 states. His previous wives had died under suspicious circumstances. The persecution he fled was not religious, it was legal, a manhunt for the crimes he had already committed. Faced with these revelations, Anna understood the impossible choice. She confronted, speak and risk death, or remain silent and witness more suffering. Every glance from Rebecca, every sermon from Daniel was a reminder of the stakes. New Canaan was more than a farm. It was a fortress built on terror, deception, and the meticulous orchestration of human misery. The world outside remained blind. Local officials, traveling preachers, even relatives who arrived with hope, saw only the facade carefully crafted by the Colemans. And inside, every day, the survivors learned the same lesson: fear was law, and obedience was survival. At New Canaan, the evening gatherings became the ultimate theater of control. Every night, the entire community assembled in the main hall for what Daniel Coleman called spiritual instruction. These sessions often stretched until midnight, a relentless marathon of sermons blending scripture with his twisted interpretations. Every word was calculated to erode individuality, to instill absolute obedience, to convince the faithful that their suffering was both deserved and holy. Confessions were demanded, publicly, forcing men, women, and even children to admit their spiritual weaknesses. Shame became a weapon, guilt a chain. Those who faltered, hesitated, or questioned were marked, not just by words, but by the meticulous attention of Coleman's children, trained from infancy to observe, record, and enforce their father's doctrine. Joshua, now 17, commanded supplies, controlling who received food, clothing, and tools. A slip of trust, a minor complaint, or a fleeting moment of resistance could mean starvation or punishment. Rebecca, only 15 but unnervingly sharp, maintained the records, her journal tracking each transgression, every whispered doubt, every act of defiance. Ezra, still a boy, learned to follow their cruel example, absorbing lessons in fear, domination, and manipulation. The children became extensions of Daniel's will, instruments of control and intimidation, their youth a disguise for calculated cruelty. The psychological pressure was relentless. There was no escape from the weight of constant observation, from the knowledge that even private moments might be reported. Fear intertwined with faith, creating a system where obedience felt like survival and questioning felt like betrayal. Even hope was punished. The community learned to hide thoughts, to swallow emotion, to trust only the structure imposed by the Colemans. And yet, every night, the sounds from the main house reminded them that the family above thrived in comfort and indulgence, mocking the labor and suffering below. It was in this environment that the Coleman children were molded into instruments of the same tyranny they had inherited. Every glance, every command, every calculated act of cruelty taught them that power was not earned. It was imposed, maintained through fear, obedience, and the meticulous manipulation of those weaker than you. The cycle of control was self-perpetuating. The Colemans had built more than a farm. They had created a machine, a system in which cruelty, manipulation, and domination were taught, reinforced, and celebrated. By the time a newcomer understood the truth, it was too late. The community had internalized its own oppression. Faith, loyalty, love, even hope, had been twisted into weapons against themselves. The Colemans' world was one where the mind was as captive as the body, and the horrors had only just begun to deepen. By the mid-1840s, New Canaan was no longer a farm, it was a self-contained engine of suffering. The community had grown to over 200 souls, each drawn by promises of salvation or forced into the relentless cycle of obedience. Workdays began at 4 in the morning, and the thin line between exhaustion and collapse was crossed daily. Men labored in the fields and workshops, women in kitchens and laundry, and children, some as young as 5, were pressed into service, their small hands perfect for tasks adults could barely manage. Those who faltered, who displayed weakness or questioned authority, disappeared, whisked away to work parties that never returned or isolated assignments that ended in silence. Their deaths were never spoken of, yet the memory of vanished friends and siblings haunted every corner of the community. The children who survived were carefully groomed to continue the family's system of control. Those showing intelligence, strength, or charisma were taken from their parents and raised under the Coleman doctrine, trained to enforce fear and perpetuate obedience. Others, considered unfit, were pushed to labor until their small bodies failed, many never reaching their 10th birthday. Discipline was absolute, punishment swift, and the lessons of terror were repeated nightly during gatherings, where public confessions reinforced submission and reminded everyone of the cost of disobedience. Even in sickness, the Colemans wielded control. Contaminated food, tainted blankets, and carefully timed neglect ensured that the weak perished, their deaths framed as divine will. Yet the Colemans themselves remained untouched by suffering. Their quarters were warm, their tables full, their clothing clean. The contrast was deliberate, a psychological hammer striking daily, reminding every soul below the hill of the hierarchy that could not be challenged. The isolation of New Canaan amplified the horror. 15 miles separated the community from Athens through dangerous forests that discouraged escape. Letters were censored, visitors carefully orchestrated tours, and any report of trouble dismissed as rumor. Every death, every act of cruelty, every disappearance was cloaked in the sanctity of faith, and the world beyond the hills remained blind. Within the valley, the Colemans' power was absolute. By now, the survivors understood one immutable truth: resistance was fatal, escape nearly impossible, and hope itself had been twisted into obedience. The family had created more than a community. They had forged a system where every human instinct was inverted and every soul was a tool for their wealth and dominance. New Canaan was their empire, and the horror was methodical, deliberate, and unrelenting. By the late 1840s, elder Daniel Coleman had perfected the machinery of deception. New arrivals came full of hope, carrying life savings, livestock, tools, and dreams of salvation. They were greeted with feigned warmth, shown only what Coleman wanted them to see: a thriving farm, devoted families, and the promise of spiritual fulfillment. But beneath the surface, every penny, every asset, every ounce of labor was extracted with precision. Coleman had transformed faith into currency, suffering into profit, and obedience into an invisible toll paid in fear and sweat. The new families were carefully observed from the moment they arrived. Joshua managed their tools and provisions, allowing small shortages to foster dependence. Rebecca recorded behaviors, noting hesitations, complaints, or glimmers of independent thought. Those deemed weak or resistant were pushed into punishing labor, often in isolation, while the strongest were slowly co-opted, groomed to serve as enforcers or lieutenants. Even children were assessed, their potential for obedience or cruelty measured with terrifying accuracy. The Coleman family's wealth grew alongside their dominion. Crops and livestock were sold in distant markets, mills processed grain for neighboring farms, and all profits were funneled into the family's private coffers. And while outsiders occasionally visited, traveling preachers, local officials, or distant relatives, Coleman orchestrated every moment. Only the healthiest, most compliant community members were shown. The sick, starving, and weak were hidden or sent on distant assignments that rarely returned. Reports to authorities painted a picture of pious harmony, effectively shielding the family from scrutiny. Even death was monetized. Families arriving with savings left them behind when they faltered. Estates, inheritances, and personal possessions were hoarded in hidden chambers, their owners erased from existence. The Colemans had created a system where new arrivals were not just laborers. They were investments, and every misfortune, illness, or disappearance was calculated to protect and increase that wealth. And yet, for all this cunning, the heart of the system was not just greed, it was absolute control. Every act of cruelty, every manipulation, every carefully crafted lie reinforced a hierarchy so rigid that the survivors had internalized their own subjugation. Fear became instinct, obedience automatic, and hope was forever tainted. New Canaan was more than a farm. It was a carefully constructed empire of domination, and every soul who entered became both worker and witness to its unending, calculated horrors. The winters at New Canaan were a test of endurance, both physical and mental, and they became instruments of terror under the Coleman family. By the early 1850s, the cabins were overcrowded, poorly insulated, and ill-equipped to withstand the cold. Families huddled together under thin blankets, the bitter Ohio frost seeping into their bones, while Elder Coleman and his children remained warm in the main house, insulated not just from the cold, but from the consequences of their cruelty. The deaths that followed were brutal yet framed as spiritual favor. Those who perished were said to have been chosen by God, their suffering a lesson for the living, a reminder that obedience was safety and questioning was damnation. Nightfall offered no relief. From the main house came laughter, music, and the clinking of fine china. The sounds were a taunt, a reminder of the stark inequality, and a psychological hammer that crushed morale. Meanwhile, hidden chambers beneath the house, purportedly for food storage, became repositories for stolen possessions, journals, and records of the dead. The survivors whispered of muffled cries echoing from below, a horror never publicly acknowledged, yet impossible to ignore. Every step on the creaking floorboards above reminded them of the unseen power keeping them in place. Those who tried to challenge the system or voice concern faced swift punishment. Isolation, forced labor, or outright disappearance awaited them. The community learned the signs: the private consultations with Coleman, the sudden reassignment to distant work, the frequency with which the person's name was invoked during nightly confessions. Fear became instinct, ingrained and unavoidable. Children internalized the system early. Those who showed promise were groomed to enforce it, while the rest were pushed to their physical limits, many never surviving past adolescence. By now, the psychological chains were as tight as the physical ones. Trust within families began to fray. Neighbors watched one another with suspicion, knowing that even a minor slip could invite punishment. Letters to the outside world were censored or confiscated, visitors carefully managed, and the truth of New Canaan remained buried beneath a veneer of piety. The few who tried to record the horrors, journals hidden beneath floorboards or whispered accounts, risked their lives for a truth that might never escape the valley. It was here, in the silent suffering and hidden cruelties, that the Coleman family's genius for manipulation became undeniable. They had built a system in which death, isolation, and fear were as essential as crops and livestock, a community where compliance was survival, and every soul was trapped in a cycle of horror they barely understood. And yet, for all its darkness, whispers of resistance began to stir among those desperate enough to see beyond the veil. By the mid-1850s, whispers of defiance began to circulate through the frostbitten cabins of New Canaan. A few of the braver souls, having witnessed the true scale of the Coleman family's cruelty, started small acts of resistance, hiding food, quietly recording events, or teaching children lessons in secrecy. Even these minor acts were dangerous. Joshua's watchful eyes, Rebecca's meticulous records, and Ezra's increasing cunning meant that every movement was scrutinized. Yet the spark of defiance persisted, as human instinct refused to be fully extinguished. It was Anna Thompson who became the first to truly grasp the magnitude of the operation. She pieced together hidden journals, smuggled scraps of messages, and the testimonies of those too afraid to speak aloud. Each discovery revealed the calculated cruelty of the Coleman's poison, disguised as medicine, starvation rationed to the point of collapse, forced labor designed to break body and spirit simultaneously. The Colemans were no longer merely exploiting faith. They were creating a meticulously controlled ecosystem of suffering, where every reaction, every fear, every hope was catalogued and manipulated. Even amidst this despair, subtle cracks began to appear in the family's armor. A missed delivery, a mismanaged supply, a child hiding a piece of bread, small rebellions that, while seemingly inconsequential, carried the weight of life or death. Observers within the community started to communicate in hidden codes, gestures, and whispered phrases, creating a fragile network of shared understanding. The realization came slowly: survival was not only about obedience, but about subtle defiance, about finding the loopholes the Colemans had overlooked. It was during this period that a crucial truth emerged. New Canaan was entirely isolated by design. The 15 miles to Athens were not merely distance, they were a psychological and physical barrier. The forests, the hills, the relentless labor, and the constant surveillance created a bubble of control, and the Colemans relied on it entirely. Escape required intelligence, timing, and courage beyond anything the majority believed they possessed. And yet, the thought of freedom, no matter how distant, began to seed itself in the minds of those willing to risk death for a chance to live. Before we descend further into the darkest corners of New Canaan, pause and take a moment. If you are committed to understanding these hidden truths, type "the key revealed" twice in the comments. This symbolic act locks in your awareness, your engagement with the secrets we're uncovering, and aligns you with those willing to face reality without fear. The first glimmers of organized defiance were fragile, yet unstoppable once recognized. And while the Coleman's shadow loomed larger than ever, the survivors were beginning to understand that knowledge was power, and that even the darkest system could be infiltrated by awareness, strategy, and unyielding will. As the 1850s progressed, Elder Daniel Coleman tightened his grip, transforming New Canaan into a landscape of constant vigilance and controlled terror. No act, no word, and no thought went unnoticed. Joshua monitored supplies with meticulous precision, ensuring that hunger remained a tool of obedience. Rebecca recorded every misstep, every whispered doubt, every subtle sign of rebellion. Ezra, still a boy, followed in their footsteps, learning the language of fear, the weight of authority, and the art of control. The children had become extensions of their father's will, instruments of domination honed from infancy, a living testament to the systematic power the Colemans wielded. The punishments grew more elaborate. Minor infractions led to relentless labor in freezing fields or exhausting workshops. Those deemed too troublesome were sent on isolated assignments, far from the others, where few ever returned. The deaths were disguised as accidents, divine retribution, or the consequences of weakness, each carefully crafted lie reinforcing the fear that bound the survivors together in submission. Spiritual lessons were woven into the punishments. Every hardship was justified as divine will, every suffering framed as a test of faith. Even as despair became routine, the Colemans' wealth grew. Crops sold in distant markets, livestock raised for the family's consumption, and hidden treasures accumulated from new arrivals created a private empire shielded from prying eyes. Visitors were orchestrated, shown only the community members handpicked to display submission and spiritual fulfillment. Those who failed to meet the facade were hidden away, sent to labor camps, or erased altogether. The world outside saw harmony, while within the machinery of domination worked tirelessly. Yet, amidst the suffering, subtle resistance persisted. Hidden notes, whispered warnings, and carefully concealed actions began to form a fragile network among the survivors. Children who had been taught to obey now learned to listen, to watch, to find loopholes, to survive. Awareness became the first weapon of defiance, and even the smallest acts, a hidden loaf of bread, a secret glance, threatened the perfection of the Coleman system. The psychological grip was total, yet not unbreakable. The survivors understood that fear was both shield and chain, that obedience was a means of survival, and that knowledge, carefully nurtured, could become a weapon. The Coleman's empire of horror thrived, but the human instinct to resist, to endure, and to expose the truth quietly simmered beneath the surface, waiting for the moment when awareness could ignite into action. At New Canaan, religion was more than faith. It was a weapon, meticulously wielded by Elder Daniel Coleman. Every sermon, every prayer, every public confession was designed not to enlighten, but to dominate. The Bible became a tool of psychological control, scripture twisted to justify starvation, punishment, and even murder. Each passage was carefully interpreted to convince the faithful that questioning authority was equivalent to sin, that obedience alone secured salvation, and that any failure was a reflection of spiritual weakness rather than the cruelty of their leaders. The nightly gatherings were theaters of indoctrination. Families assembled under the dim glow of candles, bodies exhausted from the day's labor, minds weary from endless work. Coleman's voice rose and fell, commanding, coaxing, condemning. Every word drilled the notion that God's will was inseparable from his own, that the suffering endured by the community was not just necessary but holy. Confessions became mandatory performances of guilt, designed to instill shame and remind every individual that even thought alone could be sinful. Children were indoctrinated from birth. Those who displayed intelligence, curiosity, or strength were removed from their parents and trained under the Coleman doctrine. They were taught to read and write, not to learn, but to record transgressions, to enforce obedience, to internalize fear and project it onto others. The young became enforcers, instruments of control indistinguishable from their parents' cruelty. Obedience was rewarded not with freedom, but with the power to manipulate and dominate the weaker, perpetuating the cycle of terror. Even the simplest acts, speaking out of turn, questioning a task, or showing empathy for the suffering, were framed as sins. Punishments were swift, public, and psychologically devastating. Isolation, forced labor, and the threat of disappearance ensured that resistance remained dormant, buried beneath exhaustion, fear, and indoctrination. Those who survived began to internalize the system, to see the horrors as deserved, and to police themselves and each other without external coercion. And yet, despite the brilliance of Coleman's system, cracks appeared. A hidden journal, a whispered word, a secretly shared memory became seeds of awareness. Those few willing to see beyond the veil began to understand that faith had been weaponized, that religion was not salvation but control, and that the path to survival depended not on obedience alone, but on intelligence, strategy, and courage. The machinery of power was immense, but even in a fortress of fear, the human mind remained capable of rebellion, if only subtly, invisibly, and patiently. By the late 1850s, cracks in the Coleman empire could no longer be ignored. The community had grown wary, haunted by the accumulation of years under relentless labor, starvation, and psychological terror. Even the most obedient began to notice the patterns. The disappearances, the hoarded possessions, the selective punishments, and whispers of truth began circulating more boldly. Hidden journals surfaced, secretly passed between those desperate to understand the full horror of New Canaan. Names, dates, and methods chronicled years of calculated suffering, and the realization hit like ice. The Coleman family had been orchestrating death, not divine will, for decades. Anna Thompson and a few brave families began to coordinate, sharing information, pooling courage, and carefully mapping the layout of the main house, the hidden chambers, and the routes that could allow escape. Every step was dangerous, every miscalculation deadly. They had learned the language of fear the Colemans had instilled in them, and now they used it in reverse. Subtle defiance, coded gestures, and whispered warnings became their weapons. The knowledge that the outside world could be reached, that help might exist beyond the forests, ignited a determination that had long been buried beneath obedience and despair. The Colemans, sensing the stirrings of rebellion, tightened their control. Joshua increased surveillance on the supply stores, Rebecca scrutinized every glance, every hesitation, and Ezra shadowed the young for signs of disobedience. Even Elder Daniel, who had once seemed untouchable, became wary of subtle shifts in the community's behavior. His sermons grew longer, harsher, designed to crush morale and reassert his godlike authority. Yet the seeds of awareness had already been planted. Fear could no longer fully suppress it. And then came the first overt acts of resistance. Hidden food was shared, children were guided to mislead their enforcers, and messages were sent beyond the boundaries of the valley. The survivors understood that survival required cunning, patience, and absolute secrecy. Every day they calculated, observed, and adapted, learning the exact moments when the Colemans' attention faltered, exploiting the gaps between power and execution. By the time the final confrontation neared, the line between dominator and dominated had blurred. The Colemans remained terrifyingly powerful, but the survivors' knowledge, courage, and unity became a force the family could not fully anticipate. The empire of fear that had lasted for decades was now facing an enemy. It had nurtured the human instinct for freedom, sharpened by knowledge, courage, and the undeniable truth that tyranny, no matter how carefully constructed, carries within it the seeds of collapse. The final years of New Canaan were a desperate dance between dominion and defiance. The Coleman family, once untouchable, now faced subtle but relentless acts of sabotage. Food supplies were hidden, records destroyed, and the carefully curated illusion of harmony began to crumble. Every death, every disappearance, every act of cruelty that had reinforced their authority now became evidence, whispered among the survivors, documented in secret journals, and etched into memory. The empire built on fear was unraveling from within, not through force, but through knowledge and courage, the tools the Colemans had never anticipated. As the survivors plotted their escape, they uncovered the most damning truths. Hidden chambers contained decades of possessions stolen from the dead, letters never sent, and records revealing the true identities and crimes of Elder Daniel Coleman. David Khalilton, a man wanted across multiple states for fraud and murder. Rebecca's cruel machinations, Ezra's calculated oversight, and Joshua's rigid control were exposed for what they were: instruments of a family's insatiable hunger for power, disguised as divine providence. The revelation was not only horrifying, it was liberating. Knowledge became the ultimate weapon. The escape was chaotic, desperate, and dangerous. Those who survived navigated the forests at night, evading the watchful eyes of the Colemans and the isolated geography that had imprisoned them for decades. Some were recaptured, some succumbed to the elements, but many reached the outside world carrying evidence, testimony, and the scars, both visible and hidden, that proved the depths of the horror they had endured. New Canaan itself faded into obscurity. The main house fell into ruin, the hidden chambers sealed by time, and the rolling hills reclaimed the fields once tilled by suffering hands. Yet the legacy of the Coleman family endured. Stories, passed in whispers and journals, became warnings of the danger of unchecked authority, the manipulation of faith, and the human capacity for cruelty when power is left unchallenged. The psychological imprint remained on every survivor, a permanent reminder that submission is learned, fear is cultivated, and liberation requires both knowledge and courage. The macabre history of the Coleman family is not just a tale of one isolated community. It is a reflection of the systems that persist whenever power goes unchecked, when belief is weaponized, and when humanity is manipulated for profit. For those who listen closely, who dare to confront the darkness, New Canaan offers a chilling lesson. True awareness comes at a cost, and some truths are so disturbing that once known, they can never be forgotten. Remember what you have witnessed, carry it as a warning, and understand that the line between salvation and oppression is thinner than you think.